Welcome to the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. I am coming to you today from Washington, D.C., where I'm very excited to introduce our guest, Laurent Dubreil. I think I said that sort of correctly. Laurent is a professor of French, Francophone and comparative literature, and cognitive science at Cornell University. He's also the author of an excellent new article in the Harper's September 2020 edition called Nonconforming: Against the Erosion of Academic Freedom by Identity Politics. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I want to just dive right into the article, which again I thought was excellent. I've pulled some quotes from it, and I want to start with one. In the article, you write, whereas identity politics, as theorized 4 decades ago, aimed to liberate the oppressed and to oppose American capitalism, its main form today is more invested in changing the direction of domination and in multiplying restrictions. You then go on to write, in short, identity determinism has become an additional layer of oppression, one that fails to address the problems it clumsily articulates. And I thought that was a really interesting critique of identity politics, and one that's not often raised, which is that this is, apart from being problematic on other levels, it's also restrictive. It's also something that kind of boxes people into these rigid categories. And I was hoping you could flesh that argument out a little bit for us here today.
Sure. The first thing I would say is that even though you have a history of identity politics as a term going back to the late 60s, early 70s, what I call identity politics 2.0 or 2.0, which is the dominant form of identity politics today, is just historically traceable back to the roots that would be Marxist, that would be really in favor of emancipation, both individual and collective. You still have that kind of link, but it's a very tiny one. It's mainly a historical one. What identity politics became through the first important wave of political correctness in the 90s, and then through the recent, over the last 10 years, is very different. It's now embedded within digital and technological capitalism, very clearly. It's everywhere in the centers of command of American society. So you can include the tech industry, but also the media, clearly, academies, universities, which is why the focus on the piece, for the piece is on universities. So it's almost everywhere as a kind of embedded digital capitalistic component, describing any kind of political moves as a fight that would be to be fought against and among identities. So the part of what is going on through this digitization and standardization of identities is that identities could proliferate. So we're still speaking about race very clearly. We're still speaking about sex and gender with the distinction that was introduced a bit later on, etc. But identities are just mushrooming these days. And why do we have now a blonde identity that is beginning to appear as an identity with a whole narrative about harm, about being constructed by a trauma, etc., by a wound? Why do we have all of those mushrooming identities today? I believe it's tied to a kind of general social project that is appearing, and that consists in going further into standardizing modes of life and modes of existence. And it's really tied to the way social media work. It's not a coincidence. It's really tied to the way we have poorly written algorithms and software that animate and move the whole structure of social media in order to sell you the right pair of boots or the right car that you need, that is in line with what your supposed identity is. And so because of those technological tools that are not neutral at all, we are collectively immersing ourselves into a new world where everything we could become, everything we are, has already been largely predetermined along the side of a set of identities. So it's like a menu on your computer. You select which identity or which identities, if you're luckier and you have several, which identity you could pick. But those ones are pretty much set and determined by a kind of collective body that is absolutely not innocent.
I'm wondering why identity is a restrictive category. Why, and there are all kinds of identities, sexual orientation, gender, race, whatever it is, there are all kinds of them, hair color, as you mentioned, and they get really creative with them. You also in this article mentioned that there's there's an element of the Marxist concept of alienation at play here. And I am curious as to how identity is a restrictive category, despite what some of the proponents of identity politics might believe, because I don't think they fully understand that.
Certainly. So I'm going to do a disclosure here. When I was much more engaged into politics in my 20s in France, I was doing politics with Trotskyites and anarchists. So that's where I'm coming from in terms of my intellectual and political training. And clearly, the concept of alienation that was developed by Karl Marx, and not only by him, but by the Marxist tradition, consisted in seeing that an entire social structure or power structure, mainly capitalism, but it could be another power structure, would indoctrinate all the participants and sell them that they have to accept things about who they are that make no sense for themselves, but that makes sense for the system to be perpetuated. And so within the tradition of the far left, you had for decades, more than decades, critiques of alienation within colonialism, for instance, within capitalism, within masculine domination, and so on. And each time the idea would be that if you are at the bottom of the power structure, you suffer more, but there is nobody who escapes alienation within that system. The rich capitalist could believe he or she is free, but in fact, his choices or her choices of life are also determined by this kind of general structure. So that's what the concept of alienation is about. When you had Black feminists, such as the members of the collective that was called Combahee River in the 1970s, coming from a very Marxist tradition and proposing the term of identity politics, they didn't invent it completely, but they are the ones who apparently first used it as a phrase in writing. They were saying basically that if you are a Black woman and you are waiting for a liberation that would come from the liberation or the emancipation of all the members of the working class, maybe a Black woman will be lost in her specificities because of this idea of a liberation that is appearing at a level that is just too far removed from the reality and the specificities of individuals. That's where identity politics is coming from. So I could be critical of that, but at least the original idea is really about emancipation, and it includes the project of making alliances with people. And it includes the idea as well, at least in the colonial critique, that everybody would benefit from being liberated from these kind of alienations. Now, what we have, yes, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Finish the thought.
What we have now with the way identities are being conceived is that identities are to be cherished, not to be used for a political purpose in favor of emancipation, but they are to be cherished as they are. And also they are constructed, that's what the new identity politics is telling us. Those identities stem from a wound, from a trauma, from a series of microaggressions, sometimes macroaggressions. And that's the harm is giving way to the construction of the identity that is both collective and individual. And in such a manner that getting rid of your identity is no longer possible. I mean, you can, if you get rid of the harm that is being done to you, but on the other side, you are being told that what defines you is the harm that is being done to you. How could you liberate yourself from that wound? And that's why we see this kind of depressing cycle and cycle of depression surrounding the identity talk these days, where assuming an identity will always have to do with something bad that is being done to you, even within white supremacism today, even within racism, white racism today. What we see happening is an insistence on the destruction of white culture, on the harm that is supposedly done to males, etc. So you see that this is the exact same discourse about identities being anchored, being defined by traumatic experiences and aggressions, to such a way, to such an extent that you can no longer dissociate yourself from that. So you are just allowing that harm to be you. And on top of that, you have what Touré, in one of his books, called the self-appointed cops of identities. You have people telling you what an authentic identity should be, how you should look like as an X or as an Y, and people will tell you that socially, as they always did. That's what society is. But they now can tell you that through social media as well, and they can deny you the authenticity of your identity. And so identities become traps, basically. They become rigidified structures where you are constantly summoned to act like one of them. And that has nothing to do with emancipation anymore.
And it sort of recalls, I've covered some of these protests over the summer, and recalls the memory of watching a white woman shout in the face of a black female police officer and telling her that she's terrible. And one of the most interesting elements of your argument is that there's a freedom to be found in overcoming these boundaries of identity that the left is imposing on people. And part of what's interesting about this argument, and I want to keep kind of hitting at this Marxist critique of identity politics, because if you look at an organization like Black Lives Matter, which is its organizers, the people at the head of that organization, say that they're trained Marxists. Black Lives Matter has raked in millions and millions of dollars from major corporations over the course of the last few months. And as you mentioned in the article, social media, big tech companies, multi-billion-dollar international organizations really have co-opted the philosophy of identity politics. And I think there's something so interesting in that, in how right now the corporate structure in the United States, at least, and internationally to some extent, is involved in imposing these restrictions and promoting this philosophy, yet the left seems not to mind. The contemporary left, at least, seems not to mind. I find that to be a very strange dynamic.
One problem could be with the term you just used. I mean, contemporary left. It's as if being a part of the left, at least in the US, but more and more in many other countries, in Europe especially, as if being part of the left would necessarily go with an acceptance of identities as we were describing them, with an acceptance of the fact that not only political identities exist, but that's basically the only thing that exists, and that should be the basis for politics, which is just a doctrine. I mean, a doctrine that could be disputable. And then also clearly the incestuous relations between digital media and digital capitalism and identity politics is something that should give pause to anyone on the left and the far left. And there are many people who wonder what is going on here. And but it's true that when I was, so the essay for Harper's that I wrote is also coming from kind of American response to a book I wrote last year in French about identity, the current state of identity politics in the US. And for the book, I researched something I didn't know. I was not in the US in the 80s or 90s. And I did not know the extent of the reaction against, of the pushback against identity politics in that time. I was surprised to see that so many books and articles had been written from the left to the right, opposing the doctrine of identity politics. And I didn't know that. I didn't know that you had such a wide representation of political opinions seeing the problem with identity politics. What we see today is that the problem is much worse because identities are proliferating, as I was saying before, and are being sustained by a very, very powerful segment of capitalism and American society. So the problem is much more troublesome now than it was in the 90s. But the difference is that very few people speak up against that takeover. And it's also true that one of the differences that the Democratic Party re-identified itself, if I can use the term, with identity politics, at least the mainstream part of it. And you have now people who claim to be Marxists and who apparently doesn't seem to understand that if you're a true Marxist, you should put your emphasis on class, and that you should also never forget the idea of alienation as one of the terrible byproducts of a system of domination. So it's very odd to me to see people claiming that they are Marxists, and I'm not here for. I'm certainly not defending the purity of Marxism. I abjured Marxism to some extent many years ago, but still, if you're serious with the political view, then it seems quite impossible for me to suddenly turn the entire mode of analysis into something that is just reactionary in many respects.
So, as somebody who works in academia, why do you think it is that corporations have embraced identity determinism? Because my theory would be that corporations are now largely run by graduates of Ivy League universities and other liberal arts colleges who have gone through this training on campuses. I'm just so curious as to why you think it is that identity determinism is now promoted by corporatists. It's a very strange dynamic.
There are historical reasons for that, but to me the main, historical reasons, the fact that, for instance, young graduate students or young assistant professors in the 90s who might have been in favor of expanding identity politics and who lost the fight are now full professors or administrators. So maybe there's a kind of revenge, and I'm not going to name names, but I know some of my colleagues are in that category, I would say. But it's a minority. The main problem to me is with the fact that identities have been co-opted by the way social media work. And again, it's just at the beginning, it's a technical point. It's just that if you have two choices. If you want to sell data about people who express themselves online and who live online for a large extent, either you write very, very smart algorithms and softwares that will allow you to capture the tiny details and inflections of the lives of individuals so that you will have the right ad at the right moment. Or you keep with very badly written algorithms that needs fixed identities, and you convince the individuals to let go of any complexity or ambiguities that they could have, and you turn them into the rigidified identity you first had in mind. And so that's what, I mean, that's the social experiment we are part of now, that instead of, in order to make a little more money and because it's difficult to find the right engineers and the right programmers, what we do is, instead of writing a better program for the software and the computer, we program the individuals themselves. So we subject them to this kind of constant reshaping of individual and collective life through a set of identities. Why is it coming from? I mean, is it such a coincidence that the inventor of Facebook was living in his dorm as an undergraduate student in Ivy League, suddenly very socially awkward, not knowing how to connect with people and to speak to strangers, because wow, that's very terrifying to speak to strangers. And so this guy is coming up with an idea that consists in saying that basically you have 7, 6, 3 choices in life, and that is quite in line with the experience of someone who is young, who grew up in a Reagan or post-Reagan society in the US with very little exposure to other cases of individuals, and who would like to simplify the reality. But then this historical moment is just becoming something else as it is being embraced through the very structure of what we do. Or take, for instance, Twitter. Twitter is not about having a meaningful dialogue with people you know or people you don't know. Twitter is about having a soliloquy where you present yourself when you say something. But if you say something that is kind of argument, first you had the limitation in the terms of characters you could use, so that's clearly a limitation there. But even if it's expanded, if you are developing a personal argument, how could you in any way create a mass movement within Twitter? The best way to do something on Twitter that would work in terms of followers is by hooking yourself to something that already exists. And so identities were there. Political identities had been with us for a very long time. But suddenly they could represent those hooks. You could just express yourself as a white intellectual. You could express yourself as a female. You could express yourself as a transgender, maybe asexual individual. You can express yourself as someone whose main identity is to be allergic to peanuts, and etc., etc. And so by doing that, you are gathering people who are supposedly like you, even though the commonalities may be meaningless or not. It completely depends. And then the commonalities may not necessarily have as consequences that you will be on the same line about what you say, about what you think, and what you feel. So that's how I see the sudden the sudden interest in or investment in identifying yourself. Then within academia, what do? We suffer, as many other places within America, we suffer from bureaucratization. You have more and more bureaucrats running universities. You have more and more bureaucrats running private companies as well. So it's not unique to universities. So you have this bureaucratization. Bureaucratization always comes with less freedom in terms of individual choices. I mean, that's how bureaucracy works. Bureaucracy can only handle categories. It's much better at handling categories and status. So suddenly the logic of identity politics, as it has been refurbished through digital media, is making a lot of sense for a bureaucrat within academia. And on top of that, the students we get are not 6-year-old students. They already went through this immersion within ready-made narratives in high school and middle school, and immersion within digital media clearly before. So all of this is congregating into the same direction, and the same direction is to expand identity determinism on campus. That doesn't mean that all administrators or all professors buy into that, or all students buy into that.
Right. And I'm also curious about how I wonder if this generation, my generation and the kids that are younger, students that are younger than me, whether they're particularly vulnerable to identity politics, and maybe this is what changed and what's shifted between the 80s and 90s and now, because of the rise of moral relativism, and that a lot of times when we hear people talking in terms of identity, we hear this phrase, my truth as someone who identifies as X. And the implication is that truth differs based on identity. And I wonder, I'm curious to whether you think the postmodern moral relativism plays a role in fueling identity politics.
I will respond to that because that's a question I get quite often. And it's a legitimate question. I don't agree with the interpretation, but I will explain why. Just before that, I would like to say that one generation is much more impacted than the other ones, but it doesn't mean that you have one generation as one block. I mean, I have lots of students who are in their early 20s who I'm not teaching the refusal of identity politics in my. I mean, that's not the classes I offer, but I sometimes speak against identity politics because when I work on poetry, it makes sense sometimes to speak along those lines. So I happen to have discussions with students, some of them very young, some of them agree with me, others disagree, but I would like to say that at least from my small practice and perspective, I see many people from that young generation who have at least doubts about the kind of rewriting of the entire reality according to identities that is taking place. So it's not an entire generation, but it's true that the immersion within digital media on one hand and the academic propaganda or bureaucratic propaganda on the other hand is impacting much more one generation than the other ones. But again, it's not one generation against the other. The problem I have with the argument about moral relativism is that what I see happening today in terms of proclamations of truth based on identities is that you have no relativism at all. You have quite the opposite. You have a kind of absolutism. So I understand when you say that we find people saying, as an X, I believe that, and it should be okay. But the belief in question is absolute. And it's not. Moral relativism should come and used to come with the idea that in the end, we all have our truth and, we'll try to manage. But, things are upended. Things are to be explored, but there is no definitive truth. When you are silencing someone, or when you are writing a petition saying that a painting by Balthus should be removed from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, it's not exactly relativistic. It's if the painting is removed, or in another petition I'm thinking about if a painting is destroyed, or if a book is not published, or if a movie is not distributed, or if a text is not taught, we are no longer dealing with relativism here. So it might be the case that you have several truths, but each one of them claims to be absolute. And that's where we are abandoning a democratic space. Because if each truth is absolute and there is no way you can give a counter-argument, there is no way you can dispute the truth of the other one, and the end is not, well, we'll see. I mean, everybody's happy with what he or she has, and that's it. If the idea is that my truth should prevail, and I'm not going to argue in any way about why it should prevail, because deep down, it is based on my identity, and you have a different one, and you should shut up, then we are leaving democracy. And so there is no longer a question of relativism, but a question, that's the quote you were mentioning from my article at the beginning, a question of who has power and who is exerting which power against whom.
That's very interesting. That reminds me of another quote from the essay, where you write, having noticed a few years ago that most students in my classes stopped participating when we covered the history of slavery in 18th century, Saint Domingue, what am I reading? And the Haitian Revolution. That's what it says. Yeah. I was told in private by white students that they felt they shouldn't speak on such issues in front of Black students. And so I'm curious if you could flesh out a little bit of what that experience has been like. I mean, when that started and how your conversations with students have gone.
So part of what I've been doing as a professor since I arrived in 2005 at Cornell was to, and is, but largely was, to teach literature in French that would not happen in France. And so I taught about Haiti many times. I have a huge interest, and I wrote about Haiti before the revolution of 1804 and after the revolution of 1804. And to me, it's a very important, the liberation of the Black people in Haiti is a very, very important date in the world history. So I happened to teach twice a class that was entirely devoted to Haiti, culture, arts, and history to some extent. And the second time I taught the class, something happened that didn't happen to me the first time I taught it, and is that when we were reading Haitian historians from the 19th century, you had a huge intelligentsia in Haiti in the 19th century already. So you had historians writing the history of Haiti, historians writing about slavery. You didn't have so many Black intellectuals in the first half of the 19th century writing about slavery overall in the world. So when we were reading those texts, we were commenting on them. And it's true that I noticed that, contrary to other parts of the same course, the white students, to use the term white students, the white undergraduates would no longer participate. And I usually know my students well, so I can talk to them after class, which is something that more and more we no longer do, because that, in a sense, we are being told that we should avoid that, and that's also tied to the bureaucratization and the fear of any kind of unscripted behavior. But at any rate, I spoke to the students I knew well, and who were suddenly more silent. And they told me, since we're white, we cannot really intervene in the class reading Black historians about slavery. And we have to wait for the 3 Black students to say what they have to say about that. That was a very interesting moment also, because clearly we were reaching these obvious limits of identities, in the sense that the 3 Black students had completely different histories. One was from sub-Saharan Francophone Africa. Another one was from Haiti himself, but had been raised both in Haiti and in the US. And a third one was not from Africa or African descent. So the 3 Black students, in fact, could only be united from a viewpoint that was largely racist, in my opinion. I'm not saying that my students were racist, but they were just responding to the structure that has been given to them constantly. And so, on top of that, it's quite obvious that nobody was born with a natural knowledge of slavery in 18th century Saint-Domingue. I mean, that's not a quality you are born with. And so the question was, how do we have a discussion about text that teaches us, all of us, something? And so it was not a failure, I have to say. we were able to have those discussions. But the immediate reaction was also quite interesting, coming from students who all had chosen to attend a class in Haiti. I mean, that's not a mandatory class in any way. So if you're a white undergraduate choosing a class on Haiti, it's already a political statement. You're already not within the most rigidified conception of identities, or you wouldn't even be there, which is the other problem we see now in classes. There has been so much emphasis on identity matching between classes, professors, and students that the current consequence of what is happening on campus is that we have less and less students attending classes on Africa or attending classes on African American literature, at least less than before, clearly because they have been discouraged from attending something that is not their identity, and with the fear of suddenly doing some kind of cultural appropriation. So the alternative is the white undergraduate, based on the respect of the identity of a Black student, would no longer study the history of slavery in the Caribbean in the 18th century, or would not read Rolf Ellison, or would not have anything to say about the novel of Percival Everett. And so to me, it's a way of narrowing down the experience to such an extent that racism, of course, will be reinforced. Not the same kind of old South racism that we knew, but another kind of polished and kind of superficial but deep racism that will not show its true colors, if I may use that term.
That's a really frightening, and it's frightening especially when you consider that this has already happened. So I graduated from college 5 years ago, and this stuff was definitely going on then, but this has already been sort of like this has been the training that, you know, years and years of students, at least 5 if not 10 years of students who have gone through our system of higher education have been educated on, and they're now in the corporate world. Some of them are working in Silicon Valley, big tech. But they've graduated into a world where this identity determinism is normalized and is, in fact, beyond normalized. It's difficult to escape because to reject it is to be a bigot in the eyes of, you know, the identity determinists. So I wonder what your perspective is on whether we have a really serious situation on our hands with people who have already graduated and gone through the university system, and what could perhaps be done to reverse course.
Two things here. The first one is identity politics is being 2.0 is being taught on campuses, but it's not the main thing that is being taught, but it's mainly through a failure of education that identity politics 2.0 is proliferating on campus. We can think of many professors who would abide by that doctrine, but certainly they are not the majority at all, even in universities where you would have a strong level of activism. And that's not what we teach for the most part, even within the humanities. So it's more like a lack of education on campus that troubles me when I see that more and more colleagues will stop teaching some material, for instance, because they don't want to get into trouble. Or when you are turning yourself into the role of a kind of moderator in class, where you no longer challenge the students, you no longer challenge yourself, which is part of what we should do, at least when we are not professing. When we are having a seminar and a discussion, we should all be challenged, including the professor should be challenged. And when instead of that, we use the phrase, what do you think? The other ones, what do you think? And then every idea is pretty much the same. If it's completely absurd, you don't say it because you don't want to have a poor student evaluation. So it's mainly, you have some level of indoctrination, but that topic from the right is always, to me, a bit of a concern. what is more problematic to me on campus is the lack of education, is how we are more and more seeing people abandoning the task of educating the students, and how we are putting so much power into the hands of people who might be administrators, pure administrators, if I can use that term, who will suddenly indoctrinate within the identity politics, but who should just play a marginal role in the training of the students.
Right.
And so first problem I would say is that it is more a question of lack of education and how higher education is renouncing its own goals and mission collectively. And there's a lot of cowardice, there's a lot of opportunism, there's a lot of laissez-faire. So it's a mixture of all that. What concerns me is that it is not the case that only academia would promote brand of identity politics. And it is not the case that academia would be the main vector. Of course, you studied in college and I teach in university, so we tend to give some kind of importance to higher education. It's logical. But the general conversation that we find in the media, the general conversation that we find on the digital world is shaping the behaviors of many people constantly. People who went to college, others who didn't go to college. And that's why I'm sometimes a bit apocalyptic. I agree with it seems to me that it's very difficult these days not to be apocalyptic when you just open the news. It gives you an idea of America that is in one of the worst places ever. And so I'm apocalyptic also because the problem is not only located within higher education. If it were only located there, I might be a bit sad because that's what I do as a profession, but it's much more concerning because it's spreading everywhere.
One concern you raise also.
What can we do? We need to. What can we do? We need to change the way we need to change the way we teach clearly, but we need to change the way we have conversations. We also need, if the digital media are with us, which is, I believe, the case, if they don't disappear tomorrow night, then we need to have other platforms than the ones we have. Platforms for dialogue, for more complicated ideas, and we need also to speak up if we oppose something instead of doing what many of my colleagues do, that is speaking up at dinner with me sitting at the table, and then being in a very different mood when it's a public meeting.
Right.
And we need to stop that.
Well, and that's a perfect segue into the question that I wanted to ask next, which is a concern you raised in the essay, is that now school is entirely virtual, almost entirely virtual. And that is having an impact on the facilitation of conversations, which were already difficult enough. So how do you think this era of kind of Zoom school, Zoom college, is going to continue hampering the conversations? As I imagine, as a professor, it's significantly more difficult to generate organic and honest and sort of unfiltered conversations that need to happen and that are supposed to happen in our system of higher education when everybody's online.
It's almost impossible to create that from scratch. I mean, in my personal experience, when you know people already quite well, you can have a good, sometimes very good discussion over Zoom. Fine. But if you are in the situation that is much more the typical situation, you're beginning your class in a semester with lots of students whom you don't know, maybe you know one or two, and they don't know what to expect from you. They have seen many different ways of teaching. Then what is happening is that the kind of conversation I was alluding to before, the kind of complex conversation with back and forth, seminar-like conversation, will probably not exist over Zoom. Then there is without being too paranoid, there is an issue about surveillance here. Once you're on Zoom, anybody can record anything. And the students know that. And I doubt that you in that environment you would risk any improvised statement in a sense, because if it's recorded it could be used against you. I'm not speaking about I'm not saying that it's too bad that Zoom would prevent racist statement. I'm not, that's not what I'm saying, because honestly I almost never heard a racist statement in my classroom, also because there are things that, I mean, there are written and unwritten rules in a discussion. So when we speak about open-ended discussion, it's not say whatever you think or whatever you comes to mind. It's more structured than that. But over Zoom, it will be almost impossible to replicate. What works well with Zoom is what I call professing or lecturing. So you can profess well and lecture well on Zoom, with the consequence that the best students will be able to be quite good at that, and the students who would be not so good will usually have a much harder time following your class if you're just lecturing. So the tool was not designed for seminar-like discussions. The tool was really not designed for that. It was designed for the regular company meeting that you will get. The tool was could be refurbished in such a way that you could lecture, but that's about it. And so the quality of instruction is suffering and will suffer, but also the dependence, the addiction that we all, I do everything in my life to avoid addiction to new technology. I don't even have a cell phone, etc. However, I cannot say that I'm immune to technological addiction, and I can certainly feel on an individual basis, but I saw that everywhere, that after months of lockdown, we all grew more dependent on new technologies and on social media, and that includes all of this. And so the heightened dependence over digital media and digital content that is being fed or force-fed to us, plus the time that is happening on Zoom that doesn't have the quality of that in-person instruction would have, real in-person instruction would have. All of this is a big concern across the board for free thinking and free thought, and it suddenly heightens right now a need to identify. Because you are also, I mean, if you are 20, 18, you are just lost in that constant universe of blend lectures on Zoom or non-discussion on Zoom that have to happen for 1 hour, and you need to accept that it will last for 1 hour. And so the backup plan is to go back to what you already knew, what you already experienced, which is what the digital media wants you to cherish more. So you are re-anchoring yourself within the past, within past networks, past practices. You are just being drawn to what is or what used to be, instead of being drawn to who you could become and what you could do, which is supposedly why we teach in higher education.
Yeah, and that actually, I wanted to read another quote from the essay, and just sort of for my last questions, I think this will kind of bring it full circle. There's a fantastic quote where you write, "As soon as we believe that social circumstances are absolute determinations, or worse, quote, what we are, we condemn ourselves to the endless repetition of the past and to the methodical destruction of new possibilities." And to raise the question of new possibilities, as somebody who's literally written books on poetry and is a professional student of poetry, in your experience, do you believe that these rigid identity categories have harmed a generation's ability to create art like poetry? Poetry is a great category to sort of to narrow in on in this conversation, but art in general, I wonder if you think the rise and the proliferation of identity determinism and identity politics has harmed a generation's ability to create beautiful art.
If you want to express through art, through poetry, through art in general, if you want to express what is supposed to be an identity that is just a social construct that has been reinforced through a mob or through conformism, then clearly the artwork you're going to produce will be meaningless. The only meaning of an artwork is to allow you who are not the author, to allow you to become different, to be othered, to be transformed by what you read, by what you watch, by what you encounter. If art is only about reinforcing intuitions you already had, and if art is only speaking to people who are supposedly the same as the author, then you're not dealing with anything that could be called creation. You're dealing with just kind of verbiage, kind of empty talk or empty pictures that will just be used in order to be that will be used for indoctrination. And that's not something that is specific to identity politics. That's not something that is new. I mean, in the entire human history, you had many moments, many periods of time where people were saying that art should only be about our national identity, or should only be about our race, or should only promote the viewpoint of the philosopher, if you think back of Plato's Republic. And all of those attempts are the same, and they are really a dead end. The problem we face now is that it seems to me that we are going further into the mechanisms of self-censorship, at least in a society that is supposed to be a democracy. We are going much further than anywhere else. And so it's more like a dictatorial viewpoint about the role of the arts that is unfolding right now.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. The essay is fascinating. I recommend everybody check it out. It's called Nonconforming. It's available in the September issue of Harper's. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.